I was assigned to the silent ward on a Thursday in the first week of autumn, when the light came in low and flat through the stone-braced windows, and the corridors smelled of mineral balm and old scales. The transfer paperwork called it a reassignment. My supervisor, Bren Calvar, slid the form across his desk with the particular expression he wore when he was delivering news he considered a kindness and knew the recipient would not. He was 44 years old, had worked admissions at the Keth Solara Sanctuary for 11 of them, and had never once come down to the wards past second bell. He said the words, senior attendant rotation and continuity of presence protocol, and, given your experience with unresponsive patients. And he watched my face carefully while he said them, the way you watch a surface for signs of cracking. I am 59 years old. I have worked draconic hospice for 22 years, 6 at a transit facility out on the Vethis Arm, 2 at a quarantine ward during the Korath respiratory outbreak, and 14 here at Keth Solara. I have sat with dragons who were dying. I have sat with dragons who were afraid, and with dragons who were so old they had ceased to register most of the world as worth their attention. I have held the foreclaw of a 200-year bronze elder who cried for 4 nights running after her clutch companion died, and I have fed warm broth by syringe to a hatchling so underweight his ridge plates had gone soft. I have listened to sounds that no instrument in the ward could classify, and I have sat through silences that pressed against the skin. I have attended the end of things that remembered the beginning of things I will never know. I know what end of life looks like in a draconic patient, and I know what unresponsive looks like, and I know that those two things are not the same thing, even when every chart in the ward says they are. What Bren Calvar was actually telling me, and what he was too careful a man to say plainly, was this. The ancient in room 41 had been catalogued as gone, and it had become politically awkward to have senior staff running active care protocols. On a patient the Veseth sovereignty had already begun to grieve, rotating me in, a night shift attendant, older, quiet, the sort of worker institutional memory produces without ever quite promoting, was a way of maintaining the appearance of care without inconvenience of hope. I signed the form. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say Vasith Mora had gone silent, because the word silent got used so loosely in those months that it lost its shape entirely. She had not stopped breathing. She had not stopped eating in the narrow technical sense. The nutritive solution ran through the subcutaneous line in the soft scaled flesh behind her left shoulder, and her body processed it, and the monitoring equipment logged it without comment. She had not stopped moving her eyes. If you stood in the doorway at the right angle in the late afternoon, when the sun came through the upper casement and struck the far wall at approximately the 3rd hour angle, you could sometimes see her pupils tracking the light as it moved across the stone. Slowly, the way something moves when it is very, very far away, and only a small part of it has agreed to be present. What she had stopped doing was responding to voice, to touch, to the small carved horn call piece the sovereignty's attending physician used at the start of each examination, a tool calibrated to a frequency dragons of the Vasith bloodline had responded to for as long as anyone had kept records. She had stopped vocalizing. She had stopped the low subsonic hum that draconic elders produce almost involuntarily. When they are in contact with another living being they have registered as safe. She had stopped focusing her eyes on anything that moved with intention rather than light. 3 years prior, during what the records called a Kakiko withdrawal event, she had pulled herself inward by degrees over the course of about 6 weeks, until nothing external seemed to reach her. The sovereignty's physicians had a name for it. I cannot reproduce the draconic term, which runs roughly 17 syllables and sounds like grinding granite, that translated approximately to the going back. It was not unheard of in very old dragons, particularly those of founding lineage, particularly those who had outlived their bond companions and their clutch lines and the political structures that had once organized their lives. It was, the physician said, a form of deep inward retreat, Not dying, not a coma in the clinical sense, something older than either. The going back was not a failure of the body or of the mind. It was, the oldest of the Vassith physicians had written in his clinical notes, more like a choice made at a depth below the reach of ordinary volition. The self going somewhere the self needed to go, because there was nowhere else to go, and nobody outside left who could give it reason to stay. The prognosis, formally, was outcome indeterminate. Continued monitoring indicated. Informally, in the break room, the prognosis was, she's gone. She's just taking her time about it. She was old. The sanctuary's records had her at somewhere between 600 and 800 years. Draconic age tracking becomes imprecise at extreme ends of the lifespan, because ancient dragons sometimes stop carrying the physiological markers the instruments measure. She was of the original Vassith founding bloodline, which in practical terms meant that the 7 elders currently governing the Vassith sovereignty regarded her the way an institution regards the document it was founded on, not just with respect, but with something closer to constitutive reverence. She was not just old. She was the living record of things that had happened before anyone currently living had been born. She had names for territories that had been renamed 3 times since she learned them. She had been present at events that existed now only as entries in the foundational archive, entries that academics read and debated the meaning of, while she had been the one who stood in the rain when the thing happened and thought it was just a difficult afternoon, and she had gone somewhere none of them could follow. Room 41 was at the far end of the corridor, past the Nathan's alcove and the equipment locker, and the 2 rooms that had been empty since the previous autumn. It was larger than the others, built to accommodate a creature of considerable size, with a vaulted ceiling and a floor of close-fitted stone and 2 wide casement windows set high in the outer wall, south-facing, which meant they caught the sun from mid-morning through late afternoon. There was a low stone platform where she rested, curved to the rough approximation of her body, padded now with laminated thermal fabric that had been a late addition by a junior physician who had noticed 18 months ago that her core temperature had begun dropping overnight. The first time I walked in, I stopped just inside the doorway and let my eyes adjust and simply looked at her. She was enormous, not in the way of the Vassith warrior caste, which runs long and lean and terrifyingly swift. She was enormous in the way of something geological. Her scales were a deep charcoal gray, so dark they swallowed light rather than reflecting it, edged at the ridges with a faint iridescent undertone that shifted between blue and deep, violet depending on the angle. Her ridge plates ran from the crown of her skull down the full length of her spine, each one broader than my shoulders, worn smooth at the tips in the way of very old bone. Her wings were folded flat against her back and flanks, the membrane between the spars a translucent dark gray that in the afternoon light went nearly amber. Her tail, curled once around the base of the platform, ended in a ridge plate formation that had been damaged at some point. Not recently, but long enough ago that the bone had knitted in a slightly irregular configuration, a small record of something that had happened to her centuries before I was born. She was breathing, slowly, with long spaces between, the way old mountains breathe, the way you only notice it if you wait long enough. Her eyes were open. They were a deep amber, like tree resin, like something that had caught light a very long time ago and held it. And they were pointed at the upper corner of the far wall, where there was nothing. No light source, no movement, nothing that I could see. I stood there for perhaps 2 minutes without moving. Then I pulled the low stool from the corner, set it approximately 2 meters from the platforms that where she rested, and sat down. I had brought a cup of water and my end-of-shift paperwork and a small printed reading folio of the kind I carry on night rounds. I set the paperwork on my knee, opened it, and began to read. I did not speak to her, not that first night. It seems a small thing to record, but it mattered. I did not speak because I did not want to perform speaking. I had watched over 22 years what performed speech looks like at the bedside of someone who cannot respond, The slightly elevated tone, the patient enunciation, the unconscious widening of facial expression, the way the speaker's body angles slightly away from the bed while still directing words toward it, the micro gestures of someone talking at a wall they are hoping is a window. I had watched staff do it with the best intentions every day for years, and I had watched patients who were deeper inside themselves than we understood fail entirely to register any of it. The performance doesn't reach because the performance is for the person performing. It is a way of managing your own discomfort at the silence. I had been managing my own discomfort at silences for 22 years, and I had mostly learned to let the silence be what it was. I read my paperwork. I drank my water. At the second bell, I made my monitoring notes and signed the chart and folded the stool and walked out. That was the first night. I should explain something about night shift hospice work that people who have not done it tend to misunderstand. It is not primarily about doing things. Most of what you do on a night shift in an unresponsive ward is present. You are there. You are the evidence that the room is still attended, that the patient has not been forgotten, that the institution's care extends past the last round of the evening physician and into the long dark hours when nothing clinical happens and the building breathes differently and the patients, whatever is left of them, wherever they are not entirely alone. Some attendants find this depressing. I do not. I find it the most honest thing I have ever been paid to do. I came back the second night and the third. I brought my paperwork, my water, the reading folio. I sat, I monitored, I made my notes. On the fourth night, I noticed that the amber of her eyes had shifted, not dramatically, not the kind of shift that would have registered on any instrument. But the angle of them had moved perhaps 3 degrees from where they had been, pointing the previous nights, not toward me, toward the window. I noted it in the chart. Pupil displacement minor toward light source, consistent with involuntary phototropic response. The morning physician initialed it and moved on. On the 7th night I spoke. I did not plan to. I was reading a passage in the folio about the migration routes of a particular species of deep mountain ungulate that the folio's author, apparently, found compelling, and I reached a sentence so convoluted that I stopped and put the folio down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. And then, because I was tired and the room was quiet and there was no particular reason not to, I said, "This is the 3rd folio I've gone through. I don't recommend any of them." I said it to the room, not to her, with the tone of someone making an observation to no one in particular. The way you talk when you're alone and some mild frustration gets the better of your silence. Nothing happened. She didn't move. Her eyes didn't shift. I picked up the folio and kept reading. The next night I said, still without particularly directing it at her, that the northern corridor had been resurfaced, and the new material made a sound when you walked on it that I found irritating. A slight resonance, under the heel, like the floor had been given an opinion and was expressing it with every step. I said I preferred the old stone. I said the old stone had the virtue of not commenting on your gait. And the night after that, I said that the eastern window in the break room had been reglazed, and whoever chose the glass had gone with a tint I found disagreeable because it altered the apparent color of the sky in the late afternoon, made it more gray than it was, which seemed to me a gratuitous pessimism. I said this without raising my voice, without any particular emphasis. Then I went back to my paperwork. I do not know why I kept talking. I have asked myself this in the months since, and I do not have a satisfying answer. I think the most honest thing I can say is that she was a very old living creature in a room that everyone had agreed to stop expecting things from, and I found that agreement, on some level I couldn't fully articulate, difficult to abide by, not in protest, not in hope, just difficult. The agreement required that I treat the room as a room where nothing was happening, and when I sat in it, night after night, I found that I couldn't entirely convince myself of that. Something was in the room, something that breathed slowly and held its eyes open, and had once known things that the foundational archive only had guesses at. that something being unreachable was not the same as it being absent. I have never found it easy to behave in the presence of the living as though they were already gone. By the end of the second week, I had a rough habit. I would come in, set up the stool, make my initial monitoring notes, and then talk. Quietly, without elevation or performance, the way you talk to yourself when you're walking through a familiar building late at night. I talked about the ward, the small administrative frustrations, the repaving, a disagreement I'd had with the linen supply contractor about thread weight. I talked about the weather as I'd observed it through the outer windows, the quality of the light, whether the high clouds were moving or stationary, what the wind was doing to the stands of broadleaf outside the east wall. I talked about things I'd read. I talked about a colleague's retirement, and the small ceremony we'd had, and how she'd cried, and how we'd pretended not to notice, and how that had felt like the right call. I did not talk about her. I did not talk about the going back, or the sovereignty, or what the morning staff said in the break room. I did not talk about dying, or about the people and creatures she had outlived, or about the centuries she had accumulated, or about what the physicians said her odds were. I had learned in 22 years that the things people most often say to the dying are about the dying, about their own discomfort at the proximity of it, and that this is rarely what the dying need. What most of them need is someone to be in the room without making the room about them. I talked about the floor, the light, the inconvenient folio, the season turning. On the 18th night, the hum began. It was so faint I thought I had imagined it. A subsonic register, below the threshold of clean hearing, the kind of sound you feel in the sternum before you identify it as sound at all. I put down the folio and sat very still and waited, and it came again. Low, sustained, the frequency of old stone in a deep wind. I sat still for a long time. Then I said to the room, in the same tone I'd been using for 2.5 weeks, "The light's different tonight. The clouds broke about an hour ago." The hum sustained for another few seconds and then stilled. I made a note in the chart. Subsonic vocalization, brief, low amplitude. Patient origin, confirmed by resonance pattern. Possible involuntary, possible purposive, insufficient data. The morning physician read the note, came down personally, stood in the doorway for a while, then said carefully, "That's the first vocalization in 31 months. He initialed the chart with a slightly different quality of handwriting than usual. I noticed but didn't comment. I came back the next night and the night after. The hum did not return immediately. 3 nights of silence. The same stillness, the amber eyes on whatever they were looking at. I kept talking. The repaving was finished. I had found a better folio. Histories of draconic cartography on the eastern reaches, dull in a way that was at least factually dense. The broadleaf outside was losing its leaves early. I thought we were in for a hard autumn. On the 23rd night, the hum came back, longer this time. Sustained across perhaps 40 seconds, low and resonant, with a slight modulation in the middle that in a different context I might have called a question. I said to the room, "I don't know what you're looking at, up in that corner, but you've been looking at it for 3 weeks. I've looked too. There's nothing there that I can see." The modulation happened again. Not in response, I told myself. Probably not in response. Involuntary. The body doing what bodies do. But it happened when I spoke, and it stopped when I stopped. I am a careful person. I have 22 years of experience with patients who are dying, and I know what hope can do to clinical judgment. And I know how much the mind wants to find pattern in the noise of a room where it has been sitting for 3 weeks. I wrote in my chart exactly what I observed. Subsonic vocalization, 42 seconds, low amplitude, slight modulation. Timing appeared correlated with attendant speech. Appeared. I underlined appeared. What I didn't write, what I was not going to write, because I was 59 years old and had earned the right to know the difference between a clinical observation and something private. What I didn't write was that it felt in that room, in that quiet, like something answering. The communication, if that is what it was, built slowly. Over the following weeks, the hum appeared with increasing reliability when I spoke, modulated in ways that began to develop a rough internal consistency. Certain phrases I used produced a different tonal register than others, a pattern too fine for me to map precisely but present enough that I began to notice it. When I described the weather in detail, the hum went lower and longer. When I described an administrative frustration, it tended to abbreviate. When I read aloud from the cartography folio, the old territory names, the ancient route coordinates, the pre-sovereignty regional appellations, it stained in a way that was qualitatively different from anything else. A quality of attention, if attention can have a quality of sound. I began reading more from the folio. Then from the supplementary texts I found in the sanctuary's research library, the deep eastern roots, the naming conventions for tidal systems on the inner reach, pre-sovereignty territorial markers, survey records from expeditions that had taken place 300 years ago, 400 years ago, dates that fell. I realized one night while reading, within her probable lifespan, she had been there, not just alive when these places were named. She had been part of the naming. The survey records made reference, in the dry marginal notation of their era, to the founding authority or the originating sanction, phrases that meant, I came to understand as I read deeper into the archive, that whatever was being surveyed had been done at the direction of or in the presence of one of the original founding council. The boundary stones had not been placed by the surveyors. They had been placed, or formally approved, by the ones who had agreed the territories existed in the first place, and she had been one of them, one of the 7 who had stood in the rain, or the sun, or the thin cold air of the eastern reach, and decided, by the act of deciding, that this line was real. The weight of that took me a few nights to absorb. I have worked around draconic antiquity my whole professional life, and I have never stopped finding it genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. It is one thing to know abstractly that a patient is centuries old. It is another thing to sit in a room with her every night and read the records she was present for, and feel the difference in scale between the span of events the records cover and the span of her life that contains them. The way a long sentence fits inside a paragraph, the way the paragraph is still only a small part of the page. I kept reading. I kept talking. I kept coming back. On the 41st night, something changed. I was reading a survey account from approximately 380 years prior, a boundary assessment of what the record called the Vethara Reach, the eastern territorial margin of what had then been the early Vassith Protectorate. The surveyor was a Vassith elder named Koth Verath, whose survey records were thorough, economical, and occasionally illuminated by observations that were clearly personal rather than official. He noted, in a parenthetical aside, that the boundary stone at the 3rd eastern marker had been placed by the founding matriarch herself, who had, in his words, set the stone without ceremony, as though the act of placing it was simply the world being told what had already been decided. And I heard, or felt, or experienced in some register that sits between hearing and feeling, a sound that was not the low hum, a sound with form, not a word, not language in any sense I could parse, but form, something shaped, something that had gone from ambient to intentional the way a face goes from slack to present. I stopped reading. I sat very still. The amber eyes, which had been pointed at the upper corner for 41 nights, were pointed at me. I was not prepared for that. I want to say I was, that 22 years had made me equal to the moment, that I met it with professional composure and appropriate clinical detachment. I was not prepared. My chest did something complicated, and for approximately 3 seconds I was not a 59-year-old night attendant with 2 decades of experience. I was simply a person in a room with something very old that had, after 41 days, decided to look at them. I said, "Hello." The sound came again, still not language, still not anything my instruments or my training would have called a word, but it had the shape of an answer, the way a very distant light has the shape of something without being the thing itself. I said, "I've been reading the survey records, Koth Verath, from the third eastern boundary assessment. The sound lengthened, changed register. Something in the lower range that I had begun to associate loosely, carefully, without committing to the association, with sustained attention. I said, "He wrote about a boundary stone." He said the founding matriarch placed it without ceremony, as though the world was simply being told what had already been decided. The sound that came back was different from anything I had heard in 41 nights. Not louder, not longer, but different in its structure. Something that moved through registers the way a phrase moves through notes. Something that had the quality, if I had to name it, of recognition. I didn't say anything else for a while. I let the room be what it was. Then I said, very quietly, "I don't know what you've been looking at in the corner, but I've been thinking that wherever you've been going, it's probably somewhere that matters, and I'm not asking you to come back from it. I'm just here is all. I'll keep coming." I made my notes. I signed the chart. I folded the stool and walked out. The 42nd night, and the 43rd, and the 44th. The communication was different. The eyes came to me more consistently. The hum had taken on a new layer, not louder, but denser, as though whatever generated it had more bandwidth than before, more signal inside the same frequency. I had no instrument sensitive enough to analyze it, and no clinical language adequate to describe it. I used what I had. I wrote increased vocalization complexity, apparent purposive content, ongoing. I wrote it in the chart every night for a week, and every morning the physician initialed it without comment. And I thought that was probably the right thing for both of us. What I did not write in the chart, what I thought about on the walk home, in the pale autumn mornings, in the particular quality of thin light that the season produces, was the growing sense that I was in the presence of something trying to say something specific, not to me, through me perhaps, or simply in the same space as me, because I was there and had been there for 40-something nights, and had not asked anything of the space in return. And so it had become, in some fashion I couldn't fully account for, a space where something specific could be said. I want to describe, as accurately as I can, what it is like to feel that happening, to feel a room slowly fill with intent, because I have not found an existing language for it, and I want to leave a record of the thing rather than the convenient approximation of it. It was not dramatic. That is the first and most important thing to say. There was no visible transformation, no moment of sudden presence, no signal event that I could point to and say, "There, that was when it changed." It was more like watching water find a level. Each night the room was slightly more occupied than the night before, not in any way the instruments could capture, but in the way a room is more occupied when someone in it has decided to be there rather than simply being there by default. The same amount of body, the same slow breathing, the same amber eyes. But the quality of the amber had changed. The way amber changes when light passes through it from a different angle, not the substance but the relationship of the substance to what is around it. She was listening, not to me specifically, not, I think, to the content of what I was reading, though the content mattered. The old place names mattered, the survey coordinates mattered. The territory names in the foundational register mattered in a way that the migration routes of deep mountain ungulates had not. But she was listening to the fact of the reading, to the fact of someone in the room who had been in the room enough nights in a row, that the room had stopped being a place where nothing was expected and had started being a place where something was possible. That is a slow process. It does not announce itself. You only recognize it in retrospect, the way you recognize that a tide has turned only after the water has already begun to move. I went deeper into the archive. The eastern boundary question turned out to be more layered than the footnote suggested. The survey records were cross-referenced, if you knew how to follow the notation, with jurisdictional correspondence that had been filed in the sanctuary's secondary holdings. The library of institutional documents that nobody had, formally cataloged in 60 years because there was no budget for it, and the archivist who knew the system had died a decade prior. The secondary holdings were in the East Wing, in a room that was technically open to staff, but that I had never previously had reason to enter. It smelled of paper and mineral dust, and the particular dry cold of a room that gets no direct sun. I spent 3 evenings before my night rounds going through the secondary holdings, looking for the Eastern Boundary correspondence. I found, eventually, a set of documents from approximately 240 years prior that detailed, in the careful, circumspect language of institutional dispute management, a jurisdictional event in the Vethera Reach. The event, as far as I could piece together from the correspondence, involved a competing territorial claim by a coalition that had dissolved not long after, and the destruction of the third eastern marker, and a formal resolution process that had been initiated and then suspended and then, apparently, allowed to lapse without conclusion. The resolution process had been initiated in the name of the founding matriarch, and it had been suspended, the records noted in a single dry line, pending the founding authority's capacity to respond to correspondence. 240 years ago, when she had perhaps already begun the long process of going somewhere unreachable. When the jurisdictional question had arrived on her desk, metaphorically speaking, at exactly the moment she was ceasing to be reachable. When the thing she had placed set without ceremony, because the world was being told what had already been decided, was being challenged, and the only authority with the standing to answer the challenge had gone somewhere nobody could follow. I sat with that for a long time in the cold East Wing room, with the documents in my lap and the mineral dust smell around me and the thin light of the late afternoon coming through the one small window at the far end. I have carried the weight of a great many things in 22 years of hospice work. I have carried grief and silence, and the accumulated ordinary sorrow of sitting with creatures at the end of their lives. But I had never before sat in a cold archive room holding a 240-year-old suspended resolution and felt the particular weight of a question that had been waiting longer than my entire lifespan for someone to find it. It was not a dramatic feeling. It was quiet, the way important things tend to be quiet when you encounter them without preparation. A single dry line in a formal record, pending the founding authority's capacity to respond, written by someone who had perhaps expected the matter to be resolved within a year or 5 or 20, and who had not imagined that the founding authority would go somewhere unreachable, and that the question would sit in a secondary holdings room for 2 centuries and a half, getting older in the dark. She had known it was there. She must have known. She had been the founding authority. She had initiated the resolution. She had been the one the correspondence was addressed to. She had carried that suspended question with her when she went somewhere no one could follow. Perhaps it was part of what pulled her there, the accumulation of unresolved things, the weight of 200 years of governance and loss, and the gradual departure of everyone who had shared the original naming of the world. Perhaps the going back was not, as the physicians had framed it, a failure of the will to remain. Perhaps it was the natural endpoint of having outlived not just your bond companions and your clutch lines, but the entire institutional context that had given you purpose. The territories named and renamed, the resolutions suspended, the archive gathering dust, the questions addressed to you forwarded to a room where nobody came. And then someone came. Night after night, for no particular reason, with a folio about ungulate migration routes and a complaint about the North Corridor floor. I gathered the documents, carefully, the way you carry something old, and took them with me to room 41. On the 61st night, I read her the boundary correspondence. Not all of it, the densest of it, the jurisdictional event, the suspended resolution, the dry line about pending correspondence. I read it the way I read everything in that room, in the same even tone, without emphasis or editorial, the way you read something aloud when you want someone to hear it whole rather than filtered through your reaction to it. I stopped at the end of the section and said to the room, "That seems like something worth noting, that it's technically unresolved, The sound that came back was the longest and most structured vocalization I had heard in 61 nights, and it was followed, after a pause of perhaps 30 seconds, by a silence of an entirely different quality than any I had encountered before. Not the silence of something absent, but the silence of something that has just said what it intended to say and is now waiting to see if it landed. I said, "I heard you." The amber eyes held mine for a long moment. Then they moved slowly back to the far corner. But the hum that came after was not the ambient hum of the previous weeks. It had something in it that, if I had to characterize it in a word that doesn't quite fit, but is the closest I have, I would call resolution, not conclusion, not peace exactly, but the particular quality of a thing that has decided, is ready to be done going where it's been going, and ready to come back to where it started. I kept reading the inner reach, the tidal conventions, the pre-sovereignty names for territories that had been renamed since. At the end of the 68th night, I made my monitoring notes, which had, by this point, become considerably more detailed than when I'd started, and wrote at the bottom of the daily chart, in the section designated for attendant observations, "Patient is communicating, not in language, but in communication. I am documenting this as my clinical assessment, to be verified by staff with appropriate draconic communication expertise." Bren Calvar called me into his office the next morning, before I'd gotten to the coat locker. He was standing when I came in, which he never did. He had the chart in his hand. He looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone who has been delivered a problem they had not prepared for, and who is not yet sure whether the problem is a gift, he said. "Rhea," I said. "I know," he said. "I need to contact the sovereignty," I said. "I know," he said. They haven't been operating under the assumption that," I said. "I know what they've been operating under." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the chart. He looked at me. He said finally, "You've been going in every night for 68 nights. I said, "Yes," he said. "And talking to her?" I said, "Reading, mostly, the survey records, the Eastern Boundary documentation." She responds to the old place names. Bren Calvar sat down slowly in his chair. He set the chart on the desk and looked at it the way you look at something when you're not really seeing it. Then he said, very quietly, "No one thought to do that," I said. "Someone should have." He was quiet. Then he said, "I'll contact the sovereignty today." He did not say anything else for a moment. He was a careful man. He managed a draconic hospice sanctuary for 11 years, which means he had spent 11 years navigating the gap between what the institution could offer and what ancient creatures needed. And he had done it well enough that nobody had left the sanctuary feeling forgotten, which is, in hospice work, the only measure that matters at the end. He was not a bad supervisor. He was a supervisor who had not thought to do a particular thing, which is different, and I did not think it would serve either of us for me to say so plainly. He paused again, and I could see him working through the implications of this in real time. The governance dimension of it, the 3 years of grief the sovereignty had been managing, the political shape of the moment when they would have to be told that the ancient they had begun to eulogize had not in fact been absent, only unreachable, and that she had been brought back not by a physician or a draconic communication specialist or a council delegation, but by a 59-year-old night attendant who had complained at her about the floor. I said, "I found boundary correspondence in the East Wing holdings. From 240 years ago, there's a suspended jurisdictional resolution on the Vethara third marker. She knows about it. She's been trying to say something about it for, I don't know how long. I think she'll want to address it when the sovereignty comes." Bren looked at me. Then he said, "I'll pass that on." The sovereignty arrived on a morning when the sky was wide and pale in the broadleaf. Outside, the east wall had finished losing its leaves and stood bare-branched in the early light, each branch precise and dark against the white air. 7 of them. I had been told there would be 7, that this was the full attending council, that this was not a protocol number, but a deliberate one, the number of the original founding voices. They came through the outer courtyard in a column, and I watched them from the corridor window as I waited. And I want to set down what they looked like, because I think it matters to record it plainly. They were old. All of them. Not Vaseth Mora old. Nothing at the sanctuary was that old, but old in the way of things that have accumulated weight and authority and a particular quality of stillness. Their coloring ranged across the Vaseth bloodline's characteristic register, deep charcoal and slate, and the occasional ridge of dark bronze at the spine plates. Scales that had gone from the smooth brightness of middle age to the weathered, close-fitted density of ancient growth. They moved without haste. They did not speak among themselves as they came through the courtyard, which I noticed. There is a particular quality to a group of very old things moving together without speaking, a coherence that is not silent sounds, but something older than speech, something that precedes the need for it. The lead elder, the first of the seven, was a gray-blue coloring, her ridge plates swept back in the pattern of the high-altitude Vaseth lineage. Her eyes a pale gold that in the morning light seemed to contain their own light source rather than merely reflect one. Her name, I had been told, was Veth Asora, and she had been the effective head of the sovereignty for approximately 60 years, which meant she had been managing the governance of the Vaseth territories since a time when I was not yet born. They came in pairs down the corridor. I walked ahead of them. I did not speak. At the door of room 41, I stopped and turned and said, "She tracks movement now. She may not respond immediately. Give her time." Veth Asora looked at me. She had a quality of attention that was not unlike what I had learned, over 68 nights, to recognize in Vaseth Mora, a quality of stillness that was not vacancy but its opposite. She said, in the human standard that all of the sovereignty's senior members maintained. "How much time?" I said. "As much as the room gives you. Don't fill it." Something passed across her face, not surprise, something more considered than surprise. She inclined her head briefly, and I opened the door. I will not try to describe what happened in that room in the language of what I observed clinically, because the clinical language does not contain it. I will describe what I saw. Vaseth Mora's eyes, when the seven entered, were on the corner, as they had been on most mornings when the day staff came in, when the physicians made their rounds for 3 years. The room was quiet. The monitoring equipment ran its cycle. The low ambient sound, the hum that had returned and stabilized over the previous weeks, was present. Subsonic, barely there. Veth Asora moved to the center of the room and stood without speaking. The hum did not change. She waited. The 6 behind her waited. I stood near the door and waited. After perhaps 4 minutes, which is a very long time to stand in a room without speaking, Veth Asora said something in deep Vaseth, not the surface register, not the formal speech tier, but the foundational register that the survey records used, the register of the original territorial documentation, the oldest layer of the language. She spoke it quietly, without ceremony, as though she were not performing it for the room but saying it because it was accurate. The amber eyes moved, not to her, to me. It was not what I expected. And from the quality of silence that followed, I do not think it was what Veth Asora expected either. Vaseth Mora's gaze tracked from the corner, crossed the room, and settled on me, where I stood near the door with my chart and my water and my plain attendant's uniform. Held there. The hum changed register, went to the form I had come to know well by now. The sustained, lower tone with the slight warmth in the middle register that I had come to associate carefully and without overcommitting to the association with recognition. Veth Asora turned and looked at me. I met her pale gold eyes. I had nothing useful to say, so I said nothing. After a moment, she turned back to Vaseth Mora. She spoke again. The foundational register, quiet. Something I could not follow, but that had the cadence of a question. A careful question, the kind someone asks when they already know the answer and are verifying it. The response was the longest vocalization I had heard in the full 68 nights. A sustained, structured sound that moved through multiple registers, that had shape and intentionality, and something I can only call presence. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes. The 7 elders listened to it with absolute stillness. None of them looked away. None of them moved. When it finished, the room was very quiet. Vethasora spoke to her council in rapid Vasith, too fast and too deep for me to follow. 2 of the others responded. Then silence again. Then Vethasora turned fully toward me and looked at me with the expression of someone who has just been handed a fact that reorganizes the thing they thought they understood. She said, "She told us what you read to her. The boundary records, the Koth-Verith surveys, the 3rd Eastern marker." She paused. "She told us the territorial question is technically unresolved." The pause was longer this time. "She has apparently been waiting for someone to notice that," I said. It was in a footnote. Vethasora looked at me for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she made a sound that I had never heard from a dragon elder before. Brief, controlled, but unmistakably something close to what a human would call a laugh. Not amusement. Something more like the relief of finding a thing funny when you had been afraid of it for a long time. She said, "What did you do?" "On the first night," I said, "read my paperwork." She didn't seem interested. Vethasora said, "And then?" I said, "I complained about a folio and the repaving in the north corridor." She looked at me for a long time. Then she turned back to Vasith Mora and spoke quietly in the foundational register, a short phrase. I had learned enough by then to recognize that it ended in a question. Vasith Mora's response was brief. One sustained tone, low. The register I had come to know as continued, as the sound of something that had decided to keep going. Vethasora said, "She would like to know if you found the secondary holdings concerning the Inner Reach title conventions," I said. "Not yet. I was planning to go through them this week." A pause. Then Vethasora said, "She says the notation system for the title zones is inconsistent in the pre-sovereignty records, and the inconsistency was a source of significant territorial confusion for approximately 100 years. She would like you to read her the relevant entries so she can tell you which ones are wrong." I looked at Vasith Mora. The amber eyes were on me. The hum was at the lower register, the sustained, warm version. I said, "I'll bring them tonight." I made my monitoring note and signed the chart. Outside, the bare broadleaf stood in the white morning light, still and precise, each branch holding its own dark weight against the pale sky. The light came through the high casements at the angle it always came through at this hour. The room smelled of mineral balm and old scales and, faintly, of the Eastern boundary records I'd carried in the week before and hadn't yet returned to the library. I excused myself to get my coat. In the corridor, before I reached the locker, I heard Vethasora's voice behind me. She had followed or sent one of the others. I did not turn immediately. The voice said, "Attendant Sultan." I turned. It was Vethasora herself. She stood in the corridor with the quality of stillness I had noticed in her from the beginning, and she looked at me with the pale gold eyes that held their own light, and she said, without ceremony and without preamble, as though it were simply accurate, "She said you talked to the room, not to her. She said that was the only reason she could listen." I put on my coat. I said, "I've been in hospice for 22 years. Performing at people doesn't help them." Vethasora was quiet. Then she said, "She knows the territorial question is unresolved. She has known it for 240 years. She went somewhere no one could follow, in part because there was no one to bring it to." She paused. "She is now indicating that she intends to bring it to the sovereignty, in full, with the relevant survey records and the original sanction documentation and her corrections to the Inner Reach title notation." Another pause. "This will take some time," I said. "She knows where everything is." Vethasora said, "It appears so." She was quiet again. The quality of quiet that precedes something being said that has been held for a while. Then she said, "We will return regularly with the council. We will sit with her in the evenings, as you said," I said. "That's probably right. The evenings are when she's most present." Vethasora nodded. She said, "We would ask that you continue. The night rounds, the records, what you've been doing." I said, "That's my assignment." She looked at me, not with the quality of someone waiting for more, but with the quality of someone who has seen something they intend to remember. She said, "In the foundational register, there is a term for a person who keeps company with the unreachable, who sits with the absent until they find their way back." She said the word 12 syllables, something that moved like water over stone. It is not a therapeutic term. It is an honorific. It has been applied in the recorded history of the Vasith lineage to 4 individuals across 6 centuries, I said. "I'm going to get my coat," she said. "You've already put it on." I looked down. I had, I said. "Then I'm going home," Vethasora said. "She asked me to tell you something about the floor in the north corridor." I waited. Vethasora said. "She said the new material is better. She said you were right, that the old stone had the virtue of not commenting on your gait. But she said the new material has a different virtue, which is that it tells you clearly where you are by the sound it makes, and that this is not nothing." I looked at Vethasora. She was entirely serious. I said, "She heard that." Vethasora said, "She heard a great deal." I walked to the outer door and pushed through it into the pale morning. The broadleaf were motionless. The sky was the white of early autumn that turns, if the weather holds, to a particular clear blue by midday, the kind that is sharp without being cold, the kind that makes the air taste clean. I stood on the step and breathed it for a moment, the way I always do before I start the walk home, the full stop between the ward and the rest of the day. I thought about 68 nights of sitting in a room with someone who everyone had decided to stop expecting things from. I thought about the footnote, about the boundary stone set without ceremony, because the world was being told what had already been decided, about what it means to carry a question for 240 years, because there is no one to bring it to, and then to find, in the long dark hours when nothing clinical happens, someone who keeps coming back and reading to the room without asking anything of it. I thought that 22 years of draconic hospice work is not, in the end, primarily about dying. It is primarily about presence, about being in a room long enough and quietly enough that the room can tell you what it contains. I went down the steps and started walking. Behind me, through the walls I could no longer see, an ancient who had been somewhere no one could reach was doing what she had apparently been waiting to do for 240 years. Telling someone who could write it down about an unresolved boundary in the 3rd Eastern Territorial Margin, in the foundational register of the Vasith language, in the room where the morning light came through the high casements at the angle she had been, watching for 3 years, waiting for someone to stop filling the silence and let her find her way back to it. I had the evening shift again in 12 hours. I went home and made something to eat and sat by the window for a while, watching the light do what it does in autumn, the way it angles rather than falls, the way it makes the familiar strange for an hour before the ordinary resumes. Then I pulled out the cartography folio I'd borrowed from the library, the supplementary volume I hadn't finished, and read for a while. The eastern routes, the old place names, the pre-sovereignty appellations for territories that had been named and renamed, and named again across 6 centuries of draconic governance. She had seen all of it, all of that naming and renaming. She had been there for the original boundary stone, set it without ceremony, as though the world was simply being told what had already been decided. She had been there for the jurisdictional event, and the marker that was never replaced, and the question that went into a footnote and stayed there for 240 years, while the archive gathered dust in the East Wing's secondary holdings, and nobody went in to read it. And she had been in that room, in that corner, for 3 years, going somewhere that the people responsible for her care had decided to call absence. I finished the chapter and set the folio down and sat for a while in the afternoon light. Then I went to bed and slept, and got up at the usual hour and put on the plain gray uniform and drank my tea standing up at the kitchen window, watching the street below the way I always do, the quiet of the neighborhood in the middle hours of the day, the nothing in particular of ordinary life that is, if you look at it right, most of what there is. I took the route past the library. returned the supplementary folio, and picked up the next volume, The Inner Reach, the title notation. I went back to the ward at the evening bell. The corridors of mineral balm and old stone, and faintly, of something I had begun to notice only in the past few weeks. Something older, something I didn't have a word for in any language I spoke, that I had come to understand, was the scent of deep Vasith antiquity. The particular combination of scale oil and thyme, and the foundational register that lingered in rooms where very old things had been speaking and intended to keep speaking. I opened the door of room 41, set up the stool, made my initial monitoring notes. The evening light came through the high casements at the third-hour angle and struck the far wall and moved, slowly, across the stone. On the platform, Vasith Mora breathed slowly in the long spaces between, the way old mountains breathe. I said to the room, in the tone of someone making an observation to no one in particular. Picked up the next volume, The Survey Routes on the Inner Reach. Apparently, the territorial naming conventions are different in the tidal zones. There's a whole separate notation system. The amber eyes came to me. Held, the hum began. I opened the folio.